I remember the sound first, the gavel hitting the old oak table, echoing through the quiet room like a gunshot. It felt final, cruel, and cold, just like my father's voice had been in his last years. I was seated near the back, hands trembling slightly, sweat sticking my shirt to my back, watching as the lawyer cleared his throat and began reading the words that would slice my world apart. They gave her everything. The old house that had been in the family for generations, the shares in the company, the antique jewelry my mother once whispered would be mine. $10 million just like that placed neatly into her lap. My sister, perfect as ever in her tailored black dress, lowered her eyes with a rehearsed sadness I knew too well. Me. I got a polite nod and words I still hear in my nightmares. He should earn his own way. The moment those words sank in, I felt the walls close around me. Years of resentment, of being the overlooked child, flooded back. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, my heart whispered to me, they don't know. They didn't know what I had discovered, what I had kept hidden all these years, even from myself. It had started almost by accident. Months before my father's death, I was cleaning out old boxes in the attic. Dusty files, brittle photographs, yellowed papers that smelled of mold and regret. But buried between them, like a secret waiting for breath, was a thin folder marked only with my name. Inside, letters written in my mother's delicate hand. Letters I was never meant to see. Letters that changed everything I thought I knew about who I was, and who my family really was. As the lawyer finished, the guests began to leave, offering me awkward glances, empty condolences, the kind you give a stranger you pity but can't quite help. My sister didn't even look at me, she didn't need to. She had won, at least in the way the world measured winning. But I had something she could never buy: the truth. And now, standing there among the ruin of old family portraits and dying orchids, I made a silent promise. I would make them see me. Even if it destroyed everything. Walking back home that day felt like crossing a desert. The weight of my secret pressed against my chest with every step. I could almost hear my mother's voice from the letters, soft but fierce. One day this will matter more than gold. And I knew she was right. My father had buried it, hidden it from the world and even from me. But secrets have a way of breathing through the cracks of silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my bed, the letter unfolded on my knees, my mother's words dancing under the lamplight. They spoke of love, of mistakes, of a truth so painful she could never say it aloud. But it was there between the lines. I was not his son. And yet somehow that truth made me feel more alive than ever. Because it meant I had no debt to a man who had always despised me. And it meant that my place in this family or outside of it was something I could choose. The next morning my sister came by, a cruel smile playing at the edge of her mouth. She offered to help me, to lend me money, her words dripping with the same pity the others had shown. I declined, my voice calm but my hands shaking inside my pockets. Because in that moment I saw her fear. She didn't know what I knew. And that ignorance was my only power. Days turned into weeks. Rumors spread in the family like wildfire. That I had gone mad with jealousy, that I was drinking too much, that I was planning something. They weren't entirely wrong. Every night I read my mother's letters again and again, letting her words stitch together the holes in my past. And each night my resolve grew stronger. My father had always loved appearances more than people. He had built an empire on secrets and lies, on ruthless decisions that left even his own son an outsider. But in doing so he had left a trail I could now follow. And at the end of it, maybe, just maybe, I would find not only revenge but freedom. One evening, driven by a mix of rage and desperation, I went back to the attic. Dust stung my eyes and the wooden beams creaked under my weight as I searched through forgotten boxes. That's when I found it. An old ledger handwritten in my father's unmistakable scrawl. Names, dates, transactions, some legal, many not. But what caught my eye were payments sent regularly to a woman's name I barely remembered. My mother's friend. I recalled her perfume, the softness of her voice when she visited us years ago. The ledger hinted at hush money, money to keep a secret buried. My secret. My existence. My mother had kept it from me but not from him. He had known. And yet, instead of embracing me, he had chosen to bury me in silence, punishing me for a betrayal that wasn't even mine. That night I didn't cry. I felt a calm I can't quite explain, as if my life for the first time had direction. My father had tried to erase me from his story. But stories don't die when you hide them, they rot and spread. And I was done being silent. I started collecting pieces. Copies of the letters, photographs, documents from the ledger. Each scrap felt like a spark in the darkness. And though fear haunted me, fear of what my sister would do, of what the family would think, I couldn't stop. Because underneath the fear there was something stronger. A hunger for the truth to finally breathe. My sister grew suspicious. She would call late at night, her voice sharp and cold, asking what I was up to. I lied, clumsily at first, but better each time. Because the truth wasn't ready yet. It needed to be revealed on my terms, not hers. Weeks blurred together. I stopped going to family dinners, ignored messages from cousins and old friends. They didn't know the weight I carried, the storm building in my chest. At night, I dreamed of my mother, her face half hidden in shadows, whispering, "Don't let them bury you too." Then finally I had enough. Enough to prove who I truly was, and to expose what my father had done to protect his own pride. Enough to burn down the lie my family had lived in for so long. And enough to force my sister to see me not as the forgotten son, but as the bearer of a truth that could destroy us all. I remember the day clearly. It rained, the sky bruised and heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I walked into my father's old office, now technically hers, and placed the copies on the polished mahogany desk. My sister looked up from her phone, annoyance flashing before curiosity took over. "What's this?" she asked, her voice sharp. "The truth," I said simply. She hesitated, then reached for the papers. As she read, the blood drained from her face. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in, the air charged with everything unspoken between us. When she looked up, there was no pity in her eyes anymore, only fear. "You're lying," she whispered. But she knew I wasn't. The proof was right there, in my mother's handwriting, in the ledger's numbers, in the photographs that told a story no inheritance could bury. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, the rain drummed against the windows, steady and relentless. And in that silence, I saw her understanding dawn, that the fortune she had clung to was built on a secret darker than either of us had imagined. She tried to threaten me at first. Said she'd ruin me, cut me out completely, make sure I'd regret ever digging this up. But I didn't flinch. Because for the first time in my life, I realized something she couldn't take from me, who I really was. I didn't want the money. Not really. What I wanted was to be seen, to force them, even in death, to admit what they had done. To make my mother's voice matter. To make my existence undeniable. The confrontation left us both raw, trembling from the weight of the truth. She left the office, slamming the door behind her. And I stood there, shaking, my heart pounding like a war drum. Outside, the rain finally stopped, and for the first time in years I felt like I could breathe. The days that followed were a blur of whispered threats, calls from lawyers and late-night panic attacks. But I held firm. I had the documents. I had my mother's words. And more than anything, I had my own voice, something my father had tried to silence but failed. One morning my sister called me. Her voice was quieter, edges dulled by exhaustion. She offered a deal. Money, silence, a way to make this go away. But I refused. Because this wasn't about money anymore. It was about the story. About not letting them write me out of it. Rumors spread through the family again. But this time not about my jealousy or failure. This time it was about my father, about what he had hidden, about what my sister had known and ignored. The silence that had protected them for so long was cracking. And through those cracks my truth poured out. For the first time, cousins and aunts who had once looked past me now called to ask if it was true. Their voices carried shock, but also something else. A strange respect. And I realized that even if the family never truly accepted me, they could no longer pretend I didn't exist. In the quiet of my apartment, I sometimes reread my mother's letters. Her words no longer felt like confessions of guilt, but gifts. Proof that love, even hidden, can outlast lies. And as I read them, I whispered back to her, "They see me now, Mom. You were right. This matters more than gold." The weeks after that confrontation stretched out like an endless corridor, each day echoing with memories I thought I'd buried. Some nights I lay awake, questioning if I'd gone too far, if digging up the past had truly set me free or simply opened wounds that could never heal. But every time doubt crept in, I returned to my mother's letters, tracing the faded ink as if her words could steady my shaking hands. My sister's silence spoke louder than any threat. In public she pretended nothing had changed, smiling at charity dinners, shaking hands at business meetings, but behind closed doors the mask cracked. She knew what I held could destroy her carefully built image, and for once, I wasn't the brother begging for scraps of attention. I was the shadow at the edge of every conversation, the name whispered in hallways she used to walk through without fear. Yet power, I discovered, is a strange thing. At first, it tasted sweet, a surge of strength in my veins after years of invisibility. But as days turned to weeks, the bitterness set in. Because no matter how much leverage I had, nothing could erase the years of silence, the empty birthdays, the quiet dinners where my father barely acknowledged me. Even victory felt haunted. I thought exposing the truth would bring relief, but it brought questions instead. About who I really was, about the family I'd spent my life trying to belong to. In the mirror, I searched for traces of the man who'd raised me, but all I saw were my mother's eyes staring back. And for the first time I let myself admit, maybe that was enough. My sister and I met again, this time in the old family dining room. Dust floated in shafts of afternoon light, and the walls seemed smaller without our father there to fill them with his presence. She looked tired, her perfect composure unraveling at the edges. "What do you want?" she asked, voice raw. "I just want you to admit it," I said. "That he knew. That he tried to erase me." She hesitated, fingers curling around the back of a chair. "It doesn't change anything," she whispered. "It changes everything," I replied. For a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be. The sister who'd once sneaked me pieces of cake under the table, before ambition swallowed her kindness. But the moment passed and her walls went back up. "I can't undo the will," she said. "You know that." "I know," I said. "But you can stop pretending I don't exist." We stood there, the weight of years pressing down on both of us, and for the first time I think she understood what it had cost me to stay silent. In the days that followed, small changes rippled outward. My name, once absent from family gatherings, began to appear again. Invitations arrived, not always warmly, but they came. Cousins reached out, awkwardly at first, but their curiosity softened into something like acceptance. Even my sister, though still distant, began to speak of me in public, as if acknowledging my presence made her burden lighter too. But the greatest change was inside me. I stopped measuring my worth by what my father had denied me. The inheritance, the house, the title, none of it mattered as much as the truth I carried. My mother had loved me enough to leave behind her words, and those words had given me a strength my father could never take away. One night, standing in the empty halls of the old house, I whispered into the silence, "I forgive you." The words felt heavy on my tongue but freeing too. Forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for me. Letting go of the anger didn't erase the past, but it loosened its grip on my future. I kept the letters, carefully sealed in a box, not as weapons anymore but as proof of who I truly was. And as months turned into years, the sharp edges of betrayal dulled, replaced by something quieter: acceptance. Life moved forward as it always does. My sister married, had children. I built a life of my own, smaller perhaps but mine entirely. And though the scars of the past never fully faded, they became part of my story rather than its definition. Sometimes I still wonder what my father saw when he looked at me. Was it shame? Guilt? Or something softer he never dared to show? I'll never know. But I've made peace with the not knowing. Because my story isn't his to finish, it's mine to write. Years later, I stood at my sister's side at a family gathering, our reflections caught in the glass of the old dining room window. She turned to me, and for the first time in so long her smile felt real. "I'm glad you didn't disappear," she said quietly. "Me too," I replied. And in that simple exchange I realized the truth had done more than set me free. It had freed her too, even if she'd never admit it. When I look back now, the pain feels distant, like a storm remembered from the safety of the shore. What remains is my mother's voice, steady and certain. "One day this will matter more than gold." And she was right. The secret that had once felt like a curse became my compass, guiding me out of the shadows my father built. And though I was forgotten in the will, I was no longer forgotten by myself. I existed. Fully, defiantly, undeniably. And that, in the end, was worth more than anything they could have left me. The years that followed became a quiet testament to the truth I had unearthed. I didn't expect the world to change overnight, and it didn't. Old wounds remained. The family name still carried its weight, and my father's shadow lingered in every corner of the house he'd built. But somehow the silence between me and my sister softened. Not completely, but enough that our conversations stopped feeling like negotiations and started to sound almost human again. Sometimes, in the hush of late evenings, I caught her watching me with an unreadable expression. Part regret, part relief, and something that might have been love, buried under decades of rivalry and pride. We never spoke openly of the letters again, but their presence hovered between us, like a fragile truce neither of us wanted to break. One summer night, after too much wine and an unexpected moment of honesty, she whispered, "He did love you, you know. In his own way." I looked at her, older now, softer around the eyes, and saw a glimpse of the sister I remembered from childhood, the one who had once defended me on the playground before life taught her to keep her heart armored. "Maybe," I replied. "Maybe he did. But love unspoken can rot into something cruel." And in the silence he chose, I was left to make sense of my own worth. Still, her words mattered more than I could admit then. Because they hinted at something I'd long suspected, that even in his denial, my father had felt the burden of what he hid. Perhaps it haunted him as much as it haunted me. Perhaps shame was the only language he knew. Time dulled the sharpness of my anger. It never vanished completely, but it settled into something almost like understanding. My father had been raised in a world where secrets were survival, where appearances meant more than honesty. And though I could never excuse what he did, I could see the fear that drove him. In a strange way that made forgiving him easier. My mother's letters remained my anchor. Some nights I still unfolded them, tracing her careful handwriting under the lamp's glow. The pages had grown brittle, the ink fading at the edges, but her voice felt alive, soft, unwavering, a reminder that love could outlast even the deepest betrayal. Years brought new griefs and new joys. I fell in love, slowly, cautiously, like someone stepping onto thin ice. At first, I hesitated to share my past, afraid it would brand me as damaged, as unworthy. But love taught me that secrets weigh more in silence than they do when spoken aloud. And so, one night I told her everything. The letters, the ledger, the day I discovered I wasn't my father's son. She didn't flinch. Instead, she took my hand and whispered, "You've carried this alone long enough." In that moment, something in me unknotted, a tightness I hadn't realized I'd been holding for so many years. We built a life together, quieter than the wealth my family guarded so jealously, but richer in ways that truly mattered. In small moments, sharing coffee on rainy mornings, laughing at things only we understood, I found a kind of inheritance my father could never have given me. My sister's life followed a different arc. The fortune she received that day made her powerful, respected, even envied. But it couldn't shield her from loss, nor from the creeping loneliness that comes when trust feels impossible. Sometimes I wondered if she ever envied me in return. Not my freedom from wealth, but my freedom from the lie that had chained us both. We saw each other at family gatherings, birthdays, funerals. Conversation between us grew easier, less guarded, though never entirely free. Some hurts go too deep for perfect healing. But each meeting felt less like a battlefield and more like two survivors acknowledging the scars they shared. One winter she surprised me. Over dinner, in a voice low enough that only I could hear, she said, "I've put your name back into the family trust." I searched her face, waiting for a trace of mockery or guilt, but found only sincerity, tinged with something like apology. "I don't want it," I told her, the words coming out softer than I'd expected. "I know," she replied. But it felt wrong to leave it as it was. It was a gesture, small in some ways, yet monumental in others. Not about money, but about recognition. An unspoken admission that my place in the family was real, even if it had taken decades to acknowledge. Walking home that night, snow drifting through the quiet streets, I felt lighter than I had in years. The past couldn't be erased, but it could be faced. And sometimes that was enough. There were moments, of course, when the old ache returned. A word, a place, a smell that brought back the boy who'd sat at the edge of the table waiting to be noticed. But those moments no longer defined me. They were part of my story, but not its ending. As years passed, I found myself becoming, reluctantly, a keeper of family history. Younger relatives, children who never knew my father, asked about him, about the house, about the photos on the walls. And though part of me wanted to warn them of the shadows he left behind, I spoke gently, truthfully, balancing memory and mercy. Because the truth I'd once uncovered in anger had softened into something deeper. Understanding that we are all shaped by secrets, but we don't have to be ruled by them. On what would have been my father's birthday, I visited his grave alone. The sky was gray, the wind cold enough to sting. I stood there longer than I'd planned, words gathering at the back of my throat. "I'm still here," I whispered finally. "And I'm okay." No thunder rolled, no epiphany struck. Just silence, heavy and honest. But I realized I wasn't speaking for him. I was speaking for me. To say aloud what had once felt impossible. That I had survived him not by becoming what he wanted, but by finding who I truly was. Years blurred into seasons. The house changed hands as old houses do. My sister's children grew tall, their laughter echoing in rooms where silence had once reigned. I watched them from a distance, marveling at how life renews itself, even on the ruins of old pain. One afternoon my niece asked me wide-eyed, "Did Grandpa love you?" I paused, words catching in my chest. "I think he tried," I answered gently. "But sometimes love gets lost behind fear." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. Children understand more than we ever imagine. And as I walked away, I realized I had spoken a truth I hadn't dared admit even to myself. That while my father had failed me, I had not failed to find love elsewhere, and that was enough. The discovery of my true lineage was only the beginning of a long journey. A journey that forced me to confront not only the shadows of my past but the very foundations of my identity. For years I had defined myself through the expectations and judgments of others, especially my father's cold disapproval. Now I had to learn to define myself on my own terms. I started with the small things, rediscovering what brought me joy, what made my heart beat faster without fear or resentment. It was awkward at first. A stumble here, a hesitation there, as if I was learning to walk again. But with each step I shed more of the anger that had weighed me down for so long. I took to writing. Pages and pages poured out of me. Letters never sent, diary entries, stories weaving together memories and dreams. It was a private rebellion against silence, a way to reclaim my voice when the world had tried to mute it. The words gave me courage, and courage gave me freedom. The relationship with my sister remained complicated. There were moments of tenderness hidden beneath layers of rivalry and misunderstanding. We shared memories only siblings could understand. Whispers of childhood games, secrets passed in the dark, dreams that once seemed possible before life's harsh lessons set in. But there were also confrontations, sharp words spoken in anger, doors slammed, nights spent apart. Each clash hurt, but it also peeled back the layers of resentment until something raw and real began to emerge. One evening, after a particularly bitter argument, we found ourselves sitting on the porch steps, silence hanging heavy between us. She looked at me and finally said, "I'm sorry. For everything." Her apology was simple but powerful, a bridge across years of pain. I reached out and took her hand, feeling the fragile connection that had endured despite it all. Our family was far from perfect. The scars left by my father's choices were deep and complicated. But in that moment we chose to face them together, not as adversaries but as survivors. In the years that followed, I found peace in unexpected places. Volunteering at a community center, mentoring young people who felt lost and forgotten. People like me once was, gave me a sense of purpose beyond the wounds of my past. I learned that healing is not linear. Some days were harder than others, and sometimes the ghosts of old pain would resurface unbidden. But each time I met them with the strength I had built. A strength born from truth, love, and the refusal to be defined by anyone else's story. Looking back, I realized that being forgotten in the will was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to find my own way, to build a life grounded not in inheritance or approval but in authenticity. I wasn't just the forgotten son. I was a man who chose to rise from the ashes of silence and secrecy. And in doing so, I found something more valuable than money or titles. Myself. Rebuilding my life without the safety net of wealth meant learning to trust myself in ways I never had before. Money had always been a shield my family wielded to maintain control and silence inconvenient truths. Without it, I was raw, exposed, but also free to create something real, something mine. I started working odd jobs at first, anything to keep moving forward. There were moments of doubt when the weight of failure threatened to crush me, when I wondered if I was just chasing a ghost of dignity that would never materialize. But each morning, I woke with a stubborn spark inside, a quiet voice reminding me that worth wasn't measured in dollars or deeds, but in the courage to face the day. Slowly, I carved out a new identity, one built on resilience rather than inheritance. I surrounded myself with people who saw me, really saw me, beyond the stories whispered behind closed doors. Friends who celebrated my triumphs and held my hand through setbacks. Love that asked for nothing but honesty and presence. There were nights I questioned if my sister had truly changed or if she wore a mask to protect herself as much as me. But I stopped needing answers I couldn't control. Instead, I focused on my own healing, recognizing that some wounds take time and patience and sometimes forgiveness. One afternoon, I received a letter, not from a lawyer or family member, but from a woman I barely remembered from childhood, a distant cousin who had heard whispers of the family drama. She wrote to say she admired my strength, that my story inspired her to face her own family's secrets. Her words surprised me, a reminder that sometimes the ripples of truth reach farther than we expect. I realized then that my journey wasn't just about reclaiming what was taken or revealing lies. It was about breaking cycles of silence, about giving voice to those who had none. The legacy my father left was tangled in pain and deception, but the legacy I chose to build was grounded in truth and connection. Some days still hurt. Anniversaries, memories, the echo of a name that felt like a curse and a promise. But I carry those days differently now, not as chains, but as chapters in a story I'm still writing. When I finally stood before a crowd to share my story publicly, I wasn't seeking pity or validation. I was claiming my place, not as the forgotten son, but as a man who refused to be invisible. The applause wasn't for the money I lacked or the wounds I bore, but for the courage it took to speak my truth. And in that moment, I knew I had won something far greater than any inheritance. As the years unfolded, I learned to build walls of my own, walls not to shut others out, but to protect the fragile peace I had fought so hard to find. It was a delicate balance between holding on and letting go, between remembering the past and choosing to live beyond it. I often reflected on what it meant to be forgotten, not just by my family's wealth, but by the very people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The silence I endured was louder than any insult, deeper than any wound. Yet from that silence I forged my strength. Reclaiming my identity meant embracing both the light and the shadows. I wasn't just a son who had been disinherited. I was a man who had uncovered hidden truths, faced betrayals, and still chose compassion over bitterness. The secret I carried, the one that changed everything, was not just about bloodlines or money. It was about freedom. Freedom to be myself, unbound by others' expectations or judgments. One evening, sitting by the window of my modest apartment, I watched the city lights flicker like distant stars. The weight of my past no longer crushed me. Instead, it reminded me how far I'd come. Sometimes my sister would call. Our conversations remained cautious but had softened over time. There was an unspoken acknowledgement between us, a recognition of shared history and the possibility of healing. I no longer sought her approval, but I welcomed moments of connection when they came. Forgiveness, I realized, was as much for myself as it was for others. The legacy left by my parents was complicated and fraught with pain, but I chose to write my own legacy, one marked by resilience, truth, and love. In the end, being forgotten in the will was not my undoing. It was the catalyst that set me free. I existed, not as an afterthought but as a story worth telling. And that truth was my greatest inheritance. Sometimes, in the hush of late evenings, I caught her watching me with an unreadable expression. Part regret, part relief, and something that might have been love, buried under decades of rivalry and pride. We never spoke openly of the letters again, but their presence hovered between us, like a fragile truce neither of us wanted to break. One summer night, after too much wine and an unexpected moment of honesty, she whispered, "He did love you, you know. In his own way." I looked at her, older now, softer around the eyes, and saw a glimpse of the sister I remembered from childhood, the one who had once defended me on the playground before life taught her to keep her heart armored. "Maybe," I replied. "Maybe he did. But love unspoken can rot into something cruel." And in the silence he chose, I was left to make sense of my own worth. Still, her words mattered more than I could admit then. Because they hinted at something I'd long suspected, that even in his denial, my father had felt the burden of what he hid. Perhaps it haunted him as much as it haunted me. Perhaps shame was the only language he knew. Time dulled the sharpness of my anger. It never vanished completely, but it settled into something almost like understanding. My father had been raised in a world where secrets were survival, where appearances meant more than honesty. And though I could never excuse what he did, I could see the fear that drove him. In a strange way that made forgiving him easier. My mother's letters remained my anchor. Some nights I still unfolded them, tracing her careful handwriting under the lamp's glow. The pages had grown brittle, the ink fading at the edges, but her voice felt alive, soft, unwavering, a reminder that love could outlast even the deepest betrayal. Years brought new griefs and new joys. I fell in love, slowly, cautiously, like someone stepping onto thin ice. At first, I hesitated to share my past, afraid it would brand me as damaged, as unworthy. But love taught me that secrets weigh more in silence than they do when spoken aloud. And so, one night, I told her everything. The letters, the ledger, the day I discovered I wasn't my father's son. She didn't flinch. Instead, she took my hand and whispered, "You've carried this alone long enough." In that moment, something in me unknotted, a tightness I hadn't realized I'd been holding for so many years. We built a life together, quieter than the wealth my family guarded so jealously, but richer in ways that truly mattered. In small moments, sharing coffee on rainy mornings, laughing at things only we understood, I found a kind of inheritance my father could never have given me. My sister's life followed a different arc. The fortune she received that day made her powerful, respected, even envied. But it couldn't shield her from loss, nor from the creeping loneliness that comes when trust feels impossible. Sometimes I wondered if she ever envied me in return. Not my freedom from wealth, but my freedom from the lie that had chained us both. We saw each other at family gatherings, birthdays, funerals. Conversation between us grew easier, less guarded, though never entirely free. Some hurts go too deep for perfect healing. But each meeting felt less like a battlefield and more like two survivors acknowledging the scars they shared. One winter she surprised me. Over dinner, in a voice low enough that only I could hear, she said, "I've put your name back into the family trust." I searched her face, waiting for a trace of mockery or guilt, but found only sincerity, tinged with something like apology. "I don't want it," I told her, the words coming out softer than I'd expected. "I know," she replied. But it felt wrong to leave it as it was. It was a gesture, small in some ways, yet monumental in others. Not about money, but about recognition. An unspoken admission that my place in the family was real, even if it had taken decades to acknowledge. Walking home that night, snow drifting through the quiet streets, I felt lighter than I had in years. The past couldn't be erased, but it could be faced. And sometimes that was enough. There were moments, of course, when the old ache returned. A word, a place, a smell that brought back the boy who'd sat at the edge of the table waiting to be noticed. But those moments no longer defined me. They were part of my story, but not its ending. As years passed, I found myself becoming, reluctantly, a keeper of family history. Younger relatives, children who never knew my father, asked about him, about the house, about the photos on the walls. And though part of me wanted to warn them of the shadows he left behind, I spoke gently, truthfully, balancing memory and mercy. Because the truth I'd once uncovered in anger had softened into something deeper. Understanding that we are all shaped by secrets, but we don't have to be ruled by them. On what would have been my father's birthday, I visited his grave alone. The sky was gray, the wind cold enough to sting. I stood there longer than I'd planned, words gathering at the back of my throat. "I'm still here," I whispered finally. "And I'm okay." No thunder rolled, no epiphany struck. Just silence, heavy and honest. But I realized I wasn't speaking for him. I was speaking for me. To say aloud what had once felt impossible. That I had survived him not by becoming what he wanted, but by finding who I truly was. Years blurred into seasons. The house changed hands as old houses do. My sister's children grew tall, their laughter echoing in rooms where silence had once reigned. I watched them from a distance, marveling at how life renews itself, even on the ruins of old pain. One afternoon my niece asked me wide-eyed, "Did Grandpa love you?" I paused, words catching in my chest. "I think he tried," I answered gently. "But sometimes love gets lost behind fear." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. Children understand more than we ever imagine. And as I walked away, I realized I had spoken a truth I hadn't dared admit even to myself. That while my father had failed me, I had not failed to find love elsewhere, and that was enough. Life carried on in its steady, unpredictable way. The years that had once seemed so heavy with pain began to lighten, though their shadows never fully disappeared. I found peace not in forgetting but in embracing every part of my journey. The wounds, the triumphs, the quiet moments that stitched my story together. Work became more than just a means to survive. It became a way to create, to contribute, to build a life grounded in purpose rather than inheritance. I pursued passions I'd set aside, exploring new interests that made me feel alive in ways money never had. Each small success was a victory, a proof that I could stand on my own, not because I had to, but because I chose to. My sister and I reached an uneasy understanding. We didn't become close, but the animosity that once threatened to consume us softened into something bearable. A respect perhaps for the battles each of us had fought alone. We exchanged fewer words, but when we did, they were honest and unguarded. At family events, I no longer felt like an outsider looking in. My name was spoken without hesitation, and though the past lingered, the present offered glimpses of reconciliation. It wasn't perfect, family never is, but it was real. Love grew quietly in my life, steady and patient. I learned to trust again, to open myself without fear that I'd be discarded like a forgotten heirloom. My partner became my greatest support, someone who held my past with gentle hands and celebrated my present with unwavering belief. Sometimes, late at night, I'd revisit the letters my mother left behind. Their fragile pages whispered of a love that defied silence and time, a love that had given me strength even when I felt most alone. I kept them close, a reminder that identity is forged not just by blood, but by the stories we choose to carry forward. On my own terms, I wrote a letter to my father, one I never sent. I told him of the man I had become, of the forgiveness I'd found despite the hurt. I thanked him for the lessons, painful though they were, and let go of the bitterness that once chained me. The legacy of being forgotten in the will became a symbol not of loss but of liberation. It taught me that sometimes what's left behind matters less than what we build ourselves. And in that truth I found my freedom. The path forward wasn't always clear. Some days the past felt like a storm raging inside me, threatening to pull me under. Memories of being overlooked, of hearing my sister praised while I was dismissed, still echoed in my mind. But I learned to face those storms head-on, to let them wash over me without drowning my spirit. I sought therapy, something I had resisted for years. Talking through the tangled emotions, naming the pain, the anger, the longing, helped me untangle the knots I'd carried silently. Each session was a step toward reclaiming my sense of self, not defined by others' judgments but by my own truth. Work became a refuge and a source of pride. I poured myself into projects that mattered, building a career that was mine and mine alone. The long hours, the challenges, they gave me structure and purpose, and slowly they rewrote my story from one of loss to one of achievement. Friendships deepened as I learned to trust again. I surrounded myself with people who saw me for who I was, not who I was expected to be. Their belief in me was a balm, their laughter a healing sound after years of silence. My relationship with my sister remained complicated. We didn't erase the past, but we found ways to coexist. Moments of grace amid the lingering tensions. She called on my birthday, sent a message when she heard I was unwell, gestures small but significant. One evening, during a family gathering that felt less like a battlefield and more like a fragile piece, she pulled me aside. Her eyes were tired but sincere. "I don't know how to fix what happened," she said softly, "but I want you to know I'm trying." I nodded, understanding that healing doesn't come all at once but in fragments, small, tentative steps toward something better. As time passed, I discovered that being forgotten in the will wasn't a sentence, but a catalyst. It forced me to look inward, to build a life grounded in authenticity rather than inheritance. It challenged me to find worth beyond wealth and approval. And in that journey I found freedom, the kind that no amount of money could buy. The journey from being forgotten to becoming whole was neither quick nor easy. Every day presented new challenges and reminders of the past I was trying to outrun. Yet the past had a way of following me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Some mornings I woke up feeling hollow, haunted by memories of the courtroom, the reading of the will, and the cold dismissal by my own family. It was in those moments that the weight of being forgotten pressed the hardest, threatening to pull me back into despair. But I refused to be swallowed by it. I reminded myself that my worth wasn't tied to an inheritance or the approval of those who had abandoned me emotionally. That truth became a mantra, echoing in my mind as I went through the motions of building a new life. Therapy was a turning point. Sitting in a quiet room with a compassionate stranger who listened without judgment was surreal at first. but slowly it became a safe space to unravel the tangled emotions that had been trapped inside me for years. I spoke of anger, betrayal, loneliness, feelings I'd buried deep even from myself. I let myself cry when words failed, allowed myself to grieve for the childhood I never truly had, and for the family that had failed me. Piece by piece, the heavy armor I wore began to crack, revealing a man who was tired but determined. Determined not to let the past dictate the rest of his life. Work was another pillar of my recovery. I threw myself into projects that demanded focus and creativity. It was exhausting but rewarding. I learned new skills, met people who inspired me, and built a career that was mine and mine alone. There were setbacks, of course. Days when the old wounds flared up, when doubts whispered in the silence. But I faced those moments with the tools I was developing: self-compassion, resilience, and a growing network of support. Friendships blossomed in unexpected places. I found people who accepted me fully, flaws and all, who celebrated my victories and stood by me during the tough times. Their presence was a balm, reminding me that family is not always about blood but about who shows up. Romance entered my life carefully and gradually. Trust didn't come easily. I was wary of letting someone close, afraid of being hurt again. But with time, patience, and honesty, love blossomed. Not the flashy fairy tale kind, but the steady, enduring love that offers safety and acceptance. My sister and I continued to navigate our complicated relationship. She was no longer the enemy, but not yet a true ally. We exchanged cautious words at family events, shared polite conversations that sometimes hinted at something more beneath the surface. One afternoon she surprised me by showing up at my door. She held out a small box wrapped simply. "I found this," she said softly. "It belonged to Mom." Inside were letters, faded and fragile, written by my mother in the years before her death. Reading them, I felt the weight of her love and pain, words that bridged the silence between us. It was a moment of healing, imperfect but real. Through it all, I learned that healing is not a destination but a journey. It's messy, nonlinear, and deeply personal. Being forgotten in the will was a painful chapter, but it was also the catalyst that forced me to confront my past, reclaim my identity, and choose who I wanted to become. In the end, I realized that true inheritance is not about money or possessions, but about the strength to rise, the courage to forgive, and the freedom to live authentically. And that was a legacy worth embracing. After years of struggle and quiet growth, I found myself at a crossroads, not one marked by grand events, but by the subtle shifts that signal real change. I had learned to stand firm in my own truth, but the world around me was still complicated, tangled with old wounds and fragile connections. One evening, I received an unexpected call from my sister. Her voice was hesitant, unsure, but beneath it I sensed a flicker of something new, a desire to bridge the gap between us. "I'm coming over," she said simply. When she arrived, the air between us was thick with years of silence and unspoken words. But instead of diving into confrontation, we sat together quietly, the tension easing with every passing minute. She shared stories I had never heard, memories of our mother, regrets about the past, and fears about the future. For the first time, I saw not the rival I had fought against, but a woman struggling with her own pain. I listened and I spoke too, not about money or betrayal, but about healing and hope. That night marked a turning point. While we didn't erase the scars, we began to understand that our shared history didn't have to define our relationship. In the weeks that followed, small gestures became the foundation of something fragile but promising. Calls to check in, invitations to family dinners, shared holidays that felt less like battles and more like reunions. My life, once defined by absence and rejection, was gradually being rewritten by connection and understanding. At work, I reached new heights I hadn't dared to imagine. Recognition came not because of my family name, but because of my own grit and dedication. Projects I led thrived, and colleagues respected the man I had become. Love deepened into partnership. Together, we built a home filled with laughter, respect, and shared dreams. I learned to trust again, not just in others but in myself. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I reflected on the journey, from that devastating day at the will reading to the present. The pain still lingered, but it was no longer the center of my story. I realized that being forgotten in the will wasn't a sentence but a challenge, a call to forge my own path. And in answering that call, I discovered something priceless: myself. As life settled into a new rhythm, I found myself reflecting more and more on the meaning of family, Not just the one I was born into, but the one I had chosen and created. Blood ties had once defined me, but now it was the bonds I nurtured that gave my life meaning. I began volunteering with a local community group that helped young people who, like me, had faced abandonment or rejection. Sharing my story was difficult at first, but I soon realized how powerful it was to give voice to pain that many suffered in silence. Their eyes would light up when I spoke of resilience, of finding strength in the darkest moments. I saw in them the same hunger for belonging I once felt. Together we built a space where healing could begin, not through forgetting the past but through facing it head-on. This work became a passion, a mission that fueled my days and gave purpose beyond personal struggles. It reminded me that I was more than my family's mistakes, that my story could inspire others to rewrite theirs. Meanwhile, my sister and I continued to navigate our fragile truce. We didn't always agree, and sometimes the past would resurface in sharp words or cold silences. But we were learning to coexist, to acknowledge each other's pain without letting it consume us. During one family gathering, I caught my sister watching me with an expression I hadn't seen before, something like respect mixed with regret. Later, she pulled me aside and said, "You've grown into a man I barely recognize. Maybe that's a good thing." I smiled, realizing that growth wasn't just mine but hers too. The past had shaped us both, but it didn't have to imprison us. Love continued to deepen in my life. My partner and I built dreams together, small and large. A home, travel plans, hopes for the future. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known possible, a quiet joy rooted in acceptance and belonging. At work, I was offered a promotion that recognized not just my skills but my leadership and resilience. The journey from forgotten heir to respected professional felt surreal, yet deeply earned. Through it all, the letters from my mother remained a treasured keepsake, a reminder of the love that had sustained me even when family failed. Sometimes, late at night, I would read them again, feeling her presence like a warm light in the darkness. I understood now that the secret I carried was not a burden but a gift, a compass that had guided me through the storm. Being left out of the will was painful, but it forced me to discover my own worth, build my own legacy. And that legacy was far richer than money could ever buy. The revelation that I wasn't my father's son reshaped everything I thought I knew about myself and my place in the world. It wasn't just a secret. It was the key to understanding why I had always felt like an outsider in my own family. For years, I had searched for validation, acceptance, and love in places where none existed. My parents' coldness and my sister's indifference carved deep wounds, but beneath it all was a profound loneliness, a feeling that I was missing something essential, a connection that should have been there but never was. Discovering my mother's letters was like finding a map to my own soul. They revealed her struggles, her regrets, and her fierce love for me, love that had been hidden beneath layers of secrecy and sacrifice. Reading those words gave me permission to grieve not only the family I thought I had but the family I deserved. It was a painful but necessary process, like shedding an old skin to let new life grow. I spent long nights reflecting on the past, trying to make sense of the tangled web of lies and half-truths that had shaped my childhood. I realized that my father's rejection wasn't a reflection of my worth but of his own fears and failures. This understanding didn't erase the pain, but it softened its edges. I began to forgive, not just my father but myself for carrying his burdens for so long. With this newfound clarity, I sought to reclaim my identity on my own terms. I changed my routines, my environment, even my mindset. I embraced hobbies and passions that had once seemed out of reach, and I surrounded myself with people who valued me for who I truly was. Therapy sessions became a cornerstone of this transformation. Talking openly about my experiences helped me unravel years of confusion and self-doubt. I learned to recognize unhealthy patterns and to set boundaries that protected my well-being. Slowly but surely, I built a life that felt authentic. I found joy in simple pleasures. A walk in the park, a good book, the laughter of friends. Each day was a step away from the shadows of my past and toward a future I could shape. My relationship with my sister remained complex. We oscillated between distance and moments of fragile connection. There were times when old resentments surfaced, but also times when empathy broke through. One afternoon, she shared a memory from our childhood. A day when she had tried to defend me from bullies, only to be pulled away by our parents before she could help. It was a small admission, but it cracked the icy wall between us. We started to build new memories alongside the old ones, tentative but real. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Love blossomed in unexpected ways. I met someone who saw past my history and loved me fully. Our relationship was a source of strength and healing, teaching me that I was worthy of happiness. At work, I earned respect not through family connections but through hard-earned accomplishments. The promotion I received felt like a validation of my resilience and determination. Looking back, I understood that being left out of the will had been a painful but pivotal moment. It forced me to confront my truth, to fight for my place in the world, and to discover a strength I hadn't known I possessed. My mother's letters remained a cherished reminder of love's enduring power. They were my compass, guiding me through the darkest nights toward the light of self-acceptance. In the end, I realized that legacy is not about inheritance or wealth, but about the courage to face your past, embrace your truth, and live authentically. And that was a gift worth more than gold. The years that followed were marked by steady growth and healing, though the scars of the past never fully faded. I learned that some wounds run deep, but they don't have to define who you are. With every step I took, I built a life grounded in authenticity and resilience. I embraced the man I had become. A man forged not by the fortune I was denied, but by the trials I had endured and the strength I had found within. My relationship with my sister, though still complicated, continued to evolve. We discovered that shared history, even when painful, could serve as a bridge rather than a barrier. Our interactions became less tense, more open. Sometimes, we would share memories that made us laugh or sigh, moments that hinted at the sisterhood beneath years of silence. One summer afternoon, we sat on the porch of the old family home, now sold but still holding the echoes of our childhood. The sun warmed our faces as we spoke quietly about dreams and regrets. "I never wanted things to be this way," she admitted. "Maybe we lost ourselves in trying to please others." I nodded, feeling a mixture of sorrow and hope. "We did," I said, "but maybe it's not too late to find our way back." Outside, the world continued to turn, indifferent yet full of possibilities. Love deepened in my life, steady and unwavering. My partner and I built a sanctuary from the storms of the past, a place where trust and vulnerability flourished. Together, we dreamed of a future shaped by kindness and understanding. At work, I faced new challenges and opportunities. Each project tested my skills and resolve, but I met them head-on. Recognition came not as a gift but as a testament to years of hard work and perseverance. Sometimes I would find myself reflecting on the letter I had never sent to my father. The words within it carried forgiveness and release, a letting go that freed me more than anyone else. The legacy I chose to carry forward was one of strength, compassion, and truth. I realized that being forgotten in the will had been a painful catalyst, but it had led me to a life richer than I could have imagined. In quiet moments, I held my mother's letters close, feeling the warmth of her love across time and distance. They reminded me that even when life seems fractured, love endures. And so, I continued my journey, not as a forgotten heir, but as a man who had claimed his own destiny. As time passed, I began to see how the fractures in my family had shaped not just pain but resilience. The wounds we carried were heavy, but they also forged strength and empathy in unexpected ways. I started writing, a journal at first, then essays, then letters I never sent. Writing became a way to process the tangled emotions, to give voice to the parts of me that had been silenced for too long. The words were messy and raw, but they were mine. One day, a close friend suggested I share my story more publicly. The idea terrified me. Exposing my wounds to the world felt like risking everything, but something inside me stirred. Perhaps my journey could help others who felt forgotten, unseen, or unvalued. I began blogging anonymously, pouring my heart into each post. The response was humbling. Messages poured in from people who resonated with my pain and found hope in my healing. It was the first time I felt truly connected to a community beyond blood ties. Encouraged, I slowly revealed more of myself. With each story shared, the weight of secrecy lifted. I realized that vulnerability was not weakness but a bridge to deeper connection. My sister and I continued our fragile dance. We attended family therapy sessions together. Awkward at first, but gradually revealing shared grief and unspoken hopes. It wasn't a cure-all, but it planted seeds of understanding. Love deepened into partnership. Together, we dreamed of a future built on trust and openness. Our relationship became a sanctuary from the past, a place where I could be wholly myself. Work thrived. I found fulfillment in mentoring others, using my experience to guide those navigating their own challenges. The promotion I'd earned was now accompanied by a sense of responsibility to lift others up. Late at night, I still read my mother's letters. Their words were a steady light in the darkness, a reminder that love could survive silence and distance. One afternoon, I visited my father's grave. Standing there, I spoke aloud the forgiveness I had carried in my heart for years. It was a release, not for his sake but for mine. The legacy I embraced was no longer defined by money or status, but by the courage to face truth, the grace to forgive, and the determination to live authentically. In the end, being forgotten in the will had been a painful chapter, but it had led me to a life rich with meaning, connection, and self-discovery. And for that I was grateful. The past wasn't something I could simply leave behind. It was a part of me, woven into the fabric of who I had become. But I no longer let it define my every step. Instead, I carried it with a kind of quiet strength, a reminder of the battles I'd fought and the man I'd emerged as. One particularly cold winter morning, I found myself standing in front of a small crowd at a local community center. I was there to speak about my journey, about loss, resilience, and the power of choosing one's own path. As I looked out at the faces before me, many worn by hardship and hope, I felt the weight and the gift of my story. Sharing my truth wasn't easy. Vulnerability felt like standing naked before the world. But as the words flowed, I realized they were not just mine. They belonged to everyone who had ever felt forgotten or cast aside. Afterwards, a young woman approached me, tears glistening in her eyes. "Your story gave me hope," she said. "I thought I was alone." In that moment, I understood the true power of storytelling. It's not about pain for pain's sake, but about connection, healing, and the possibility of change. At home, my partner and I continued to build a life grounded in love and acceptance. We celebrated small victories and weathered challenges together, finding strength in unity. My sister and I, while still walking a delicate line, found moments of genuine closeness. Birthdays, holidays, even simple phone calls became opportunities to rebuild what had been broken. Professionally, I embraced mentorship roles, guiding others through their struggles and encouraging them to find their own voice. The letters from my mother remained my most treasured possession, a tangible link to the past and a beacon for the future. One evening, as I reread her words, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey from being forgotten in a will to finding myself had been arduous, but it was mine. And in claiming my story, I had discovered a legacy far richer than any inheritance. The path to healing is rarely a straight line. There were days when old wounds reopened, when the weight of past betrayals threatened to drag me back into despair. But each time I found new ways to rise. I learned that forgiveness isn't a gift you give to others. It's a freedom you grant yourself. Letting go of anger didn't mean forgetting the hurt, but reclaiming my peace. One spring morning, I received a letter from a woman I had met through my community work. She thanked me for sharing my story, saying it had inspired her to confront her own family's secrets. Her words touched me deeply. They reminded me that my journey, though deeply personal, was part of something larger, a shared human experience of pain, growth, and hope. My sister and I, while never fully mended, found a rhythm of coexistence that allowed us moments of connection without the weight of old resentments. We learned to celebrate each other's successes quietly, acknowledging the separate paths we had taken. Love continued to be my anchor. Together, my partner and I faced life's uncertainties with openness and resilience. Our home was a refuge, filled with laughter, understanding, and unwavering support. Professionally, I found purpose in helping others tell their stories, to give voice to those silenced by circumstance or fear. Watching others heal was a gift I hadn't anticipated. Late one evening, I visited the small graveyard where my father rested. Standing before his tombstone, I spoke words of forgiveness and farewell, not for his sake, but to release the hold his memory had on me. I carried with me my mother's letters, now worn but still vibrant, a testament to love's endurance beyond silence and separation. In embracing my truth, I discovered strength I never knew I possessed. Being forgotten in the will was a painful chapter, but it had led me to a life rich with meaning, connection, and authenticity. And that legacy was mine to own. The deeper I delved into my past, the clearer it became that my story wasn't just about what I'd lost, but about what I had built in spite of it. The wounds of childhood and betrayal had carved scars, yes, but they had also shaped a resilience I hadn't fully recognized until recently. I found solace in quiet mornings, journaling my thoughts before the world awoke. Writing helped me piece together the fragments of my identity, stitching together a narrative that was uniquely mine. Each word on the page was a step toward healing, a declaration that my voice mattered. Work brought new opportunities that challenged and fulfilled me. I became a mentor to younger colleagues, sharing not just professional advice but life lessons forged from hardship. It felt good to give back, to help others navigate paths that once felt so daunting to me. My sister and I maintained a tentative peace. We hadn't bridged the full gap, but there were moments of connection that hinted at something more. At family gatherings we shared quiet smiles and sometimes even laughter, small victories in a long, complicated journey. Love remained a steady beacon. My partner and I continued building a life together, learning how to support and uplift each other through joys and setbacks. That relationship became a sanctuary where I could be vulnerable without fear. One afternoon I visited the old family home, now sold and lived in by strangers. Standing on the porch, memories washed over me. Laughter, fights, secrets, and silences. I traced the outline of the front door with my fingers, feeling a mix of loss and gratitude. That house had been both prison and refuge. Leaving it behind was a symbolic letting go of the past, a release from the expectations and pain tied to its walls. At night, I often returned to my mother's letters. Their faded ink whispered stories of love, sacrifice, and hope. They were a bridge between past and present, reminding me that despite everything, love had been there all along. Forgiveness, I realized, was a journey, not a destination. I had forgiven my father, not to absolve him but to free myself from the chains of bitterness. In embracing my story fully, the good and the painful, I had found peace. And that peace was a legacy no one could take away. Life, I came to understand, was less about the chapters written by others and more about the ones I chose to create for myself. The inheritance I had been denied became a symbol, not of loss but of opportunity. It forced me to confront the parts of myself I had long ignored and to build a foundation rooted in my own truth. I dedicated myself to growth, not just professionally but personally. The scars from my childhood no longer dictated my self-worth. Instead, they became lessons in resilience and compassion. I found peace in helping others navigate their struggles, drawing strength from shared experiences. My sister and I maintained a cautious but steady relationship. While the gulf between us remained, moments of genuine connection grew more frequent. We learned to acknowledge each other's pain without judgment, understanding that our pasts were tangled but our futures didn't have to be. Love continued to anchor my life. Together with my partner, I built a home filled with laughter, patience, and unwavering support. Our shared dreams gave me a sense of belonging I had never felt before. At work, I embraced new challenges with determination. Mentoring others became a passion, guiding those who felt lost just as I once had. Seeing them grow fueled my own sense of purpose. One rainy evening, I stood by the window watching droplets race down the glass. I thought about my journey, from the boy forgotten in a will to the man who had reclaimed his story. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I returned once more to my mother's letters. Their fragile pages held a love that transcended time and silence. They reminded me that even in the darkest moments, there was light. Forgiveness remained a practice, sometimes elusive but always worth pursuing. I had come to see it as an act of courage, a way to reclaim my life from the shadows of the past. And as I looked ahead, I realized that my true inheritance was the freedom to live authentically, the strength to forgive, and the love I had found along the way. The years continued to unfold, each bringing its own trials and triumphs. I learned that healing is not a destination but a continuous process, a series of small steps forward, sometimes followed by a stumble back. Through it all, I held tightly to the lessons I'd learned, that my worth was not tied to a name or an inheritance, but to the strength I cultivated within myself. That love, in its many forms, could heal wounds money never could. My relationship with my sister remained complex, marked by moments of understanding and distance alike. We weren't close, but there was a mutual respect born from shared pain and growth. Occasionally, we'd reminisce about childhood memories, both sweet and bitter, reminding us that beneath it all we were family. Professionally, I reached milestones I had once thought impossible. My work became a source of pride and fulfillment, not because of recognition, but because it allowed me to help others rewrite their stories. Love deepened and matured. My partner and I weathered storms together, our bond strengthened by trust and empathy. Our home became a haven, a place where I could finally feel safe and valued. One evening, as I prepared to speak at a community event, I reflected on how far I'd come. Standing before the crowd, sharing my journey from rejection to resilience, I saw faces filled with hope and determination. It struck me then that my story was no longer just mine. It belonged to all who had ever felt forgotten or abandoned. After the event, a young man approached me, eyes bright with gratitude. "Thank you for sharing. You've given me hope." In that moment, I understood the true power of vulnerability, that by embracing my pain and healing, I could inspire others to do the same. Returning home that night, I held my mother's letters close, feeling the steady warmth of her love across the years. The past had shaped me, but it did not define me. And as I looked toward the future, I carried with me a legacy of strength, forgiveness, and authentic love. Standing at the edge of a new chapter, I felt the weight of the past lifting, replaced by a quiet confidence I had never known before. The journey from being forgotten in a will to reclaiming my life had been long and arduous, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. I had come to understand that legacy isn't measured in dollars or possessions, but in the courage to face pain, the strength to forgive, and the grace to love despite everything. In the years since that fateful day, I had built a life rich with meaning, a career I was proud of, relationships rooted in trust and respect, and a deep connection to a community that valued me. My sister and I had found a fragile peace, a recognition that while we might never erase the past, we could choose to move forward with kindness. Love remained my anchor. Together with my partner, I embraced the uncertainty of life with open arms, finding joy in the everyday moments we shared. The letters from my mother, worn and fragile, still rested safely on my desk, a testament to the enduring power of love across time and distance. As I stood in the quiet of my home one evening, I reflected on the boy I once was, the one who had felt invisible and unloved. That boy still lived within me, but he no longer held the reins. I had taken control of my story, rewriting it with resilience, hope, and authenticity. And in doing so, I discovered a legacy far richer than any inheritance: the freedom to be myself. The future was unwritten, full of promise and possibility. And I was ready.